Welcome back, guys. This is Days of Noah number 11, and I'm going to start this one out with a disclaimer. We're definitely getting ready to enter the Twilight Zone. We're going down a couple of rabbit trails today, and it can be a little confusing. I think you're going to enjoy this video. It's going to be a little bit longer than normal because it was too hard to find a break point. There's a lot of related information that all needs to be presented in one presentation. But you know, I thought originally that this Days of Noah was going to be about 15 lectures, but it looks like it's going to be closer to 20. So we're about at the halfway point. So I apologize for that. There's a lot of content, but as soon as we finish up Days of Noah, we're going to move into another series on transhumanism, and then after that, probably the New Age movement, and then after that, possibly the movie The Matrix. I've got a lot of cool content coming that I think y'all will enjoy. But for today, we're going to be talking about some pretty wild subjects. For some people, this material can get very strange. And if you've never studied the occult, you've never studied witchcraft and sorcery and things like that, then naturally this stuff can be difficult to swallow. It's kind of like if you've been drinking, it's like a baby. If you've been drinking milk for a long time and then someone gives you a hunk of meat, you just sit there and have to chew on it for a while, and you can't really deal with breaking that piece of food down because it's just new to you. So let me remind you how we started off this video at the beginning regarding cognitive dissonance, right? That it's a natural tendency sometimes to kind of reject things when you've never heard them or seen them. So if this is all new concepts that you're having a hard time swallowing, then I just suggest you take your time, go through it at your leisure. When you get a chance, do your own independent research. Wikipedia is a great resource. You can go on there and probably review one of 1,000 subjects that I've broached, and you'll get a lot of information, and you can, kind of try to make sense of it on your own. Now, for those of you who have studied some of this stuff, then hopefully today's lecture will be interesting in that it may weave together a lot of interesting things and a lot of interesting people. So one of the themes that we're going to see play out today is this concept regarding the birth of the Antichrist. The book of Revelations talks about in the last days there's going to be this end time beast system, this sort of one world system, and it's going to be the platform for a person to take power, and that person is going to be a false Messiah that the world's going to glorify at the beginning. They're going to look up to him and glorify him and think that he is something special, almost a Jesus Christ type figure. And then after he's mesmerized the whole world and placed a spell on the whole planet, minus, the elect of God, that is, those who are in Christ who have the eyes to see and ears to hear, once he's done that enchantment on the whole planet, then he's going to show his true colors, and things are going to get nasty. Now, Aleister Crowley was, he was immersed in this kind of thinking. He looked at the Bible through a different lens. He looked at the Bible through a satanic lens. And so everything was opposite to him. Most of us, when we read the Bible, we're trying to grow closer to God and we're trying to understand Jesus Christ. Well, Crowley was the opposite. He was rooting for the other team. If you've ever watched those movies where you have the charismatic bad guy that you're kind of sort of pulling for because you just like him and you don't want to see him get caught or whatever, it's kind of like that for Crowley. He was rooting for the other team, and so when he read the book of Revelations and he saw that there was going to be this birth of the Antichrist, he really wanted to personify that in such a way that he wanted to be used by Satan to help precipitate that event. And so some of the things we discussed today, I want you to keep that in mind. Now, Crowley speaks, we're going to talk about the Babylon whore from the book of Revelations. Traditionally, the Babylon whore, when, most theologians will agree that that's not a literal woman, that the Babylon whore is a symbolic representation of this end time beast system. And there's arguments where people will say, well, it's Rome, or it's Jerusalem, or it's America. We're not going to get into that today. But what's interesting is most people agree that the Babylon whore from the book of Revelations, she is a system that exists on this planet, or at least a nation, and it's multifaceted. Where Aleister Crowley differs is he actually took that as a literal interpretation, that there would be a literal woman who would be the Babylon whore, and she would be the one who would be responsible for giving birth to a baby who would grow up to be the Antichrist. And so, Crowley realized that the Antichrist isn't going to just materialize out of thin air. He's going to be born to a woman, the same way that Jesus Christ was born to a woman. And so, he became obsessed with trying to conceptualize how he could help precipitate this Babylon whore. So I'm going to read to you quickly from the book of Revelation 17. And upon her, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked with gold and precious stones, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was the name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. So, when Crowley was studying Revelations, he clearly felt that this woman was a literal woman. And so throughout his life, he endeavored to put together incantations and witchcraft spells so that he could actually precipitate and bring about and trigger the birth of this woman, if you will, her spirit, to be manifested on this planet, because it's through this Babylon whore that the birth of the Antichrist will come. I hope that's not too complicated, and we'll see how that plays out in a minute as we proceed forward. So I just want to go over some of the famous quotes that Aleister said. One is, I simply went over to Satan's side and I do not know why. He also said, I was not content to just believe in Satan, I wanted to be his chief of staff. So that kind of gives you some of his understanding. Now, as we mentioned before, his Christian mother referred to him as the great beast of Revelation, whose number is 666, which Crowley obviously embraced. Since he was into Eastern mysticism and they believe in reincarnation, Crowley was convinced that he was the reincarnation of the 18th century magician Eliphas Levi. Now, this guy was basically Aleister Crowley of the 1800s. This is a picture of him over on the top right, and underneath you can see a book that Mr. Levi wrote called Transcendental Magic. Now, the reason he uses transcendental magic is because it also has a lot of the Eastern mystical concepts based on transcendental meditation, but it merges the occultism and magic with transcendental meditation. Notice on the top, or notice on the cover of the book, you see the six-pointed star inside of the Ouroboros. It's basically a hexagram inside of a circle, but it's the snake eating its tail, which we discussed before, which basically means this kind of like recycling and reincarnation, giving birth and then death and then rebirth. And of course you see the old wizard with the long beard here in the bottom right-hand corner, who's inside of the six-pointed star, which is of course the hexagram where you can put a hex on somebody. It's a powerful symbol. Now, another thing, so it's interesting that Crowley believes that he is basically this man reincarnated. Now, Crowley claimed that obviously occult powers gave him the words to the Book of the Law. We've already reviewed that. We know that his wife Rose died from alcoholism in a mental asylum. His second wife also went insane. And in the book, Hellbound on the Trail, it's chronologue that Crowley's 5 mistresses committed suicide and scores of his concubines ended in the gutter as alcoholics, drug addicts, or in a mental institution. And so, it's sad to think about that. But as I've said in the past, the Bible says that you judge a tree by its fruit, and a good tree bears good fruit. And so one of the things that I want to do, one of the things I hate in the presentation about bringing out people and talking about people's lives is you feel like you're judging them and condemning them. And that's really, I'm not interested in doing that. That's not why I'm here today. Nonetheless, when people put out public information and they have doctrines and they're trying to lead people to other ways of believing, then it's important for us to evaluate that. Just like there are going to be people who come behind me and they're going to make judgments based on what I'm speaking now. And so these words have power. We can't forget that Crowley started his own religion called Thelema and tried to get as many people involved into it as he can. So, as I stated before, I feel called to look at his material and try and judge it based on a biblical lens. And what I'm seeing consistently in his life is bad fruit. I'm seeing bad fruit being produced from his doctrines and his religion and his faith, and we're going to try and evaluate as much of that as we can today. So, unfortunately, Crowley died, basically as a wasted away heroin addict. His final words were, "I am perplexed." And we know that Crowley worshiped the demon god Pan, which we discussed before. He's the god of sexuality and lust, the god of perversion, if you will. And of course, Crowley had written a poem to Pan called The Hymn to Pan. And naturally, this is what was read at Crowley's funeral. And the final sentence in it, which we're going to review the Hymn to Pan in a moment, but the final sentence is, "I rave and I rape and I rip and I rend, everlasting world without end." The last thing I'll say about Crowley before we move on is, people say that he wasn't a literal Satanist and that, he wasn't all that people claimed he was. But in some of his books, he did document that the best human sacrifice is a male baby of perfect innocence, because they make the most suitable victim, and also you can achieve the most soul power from that sacrifice. So, people can say what they want, but I think after we look at the full body of material regarding him, we can all come to our own conclusions about what kind of person he was. So, of course, I want to review Pan. Remember, he's the Greek god. He's the male man on a goat's body. He is a hybrid. We've already discussed where the hybrids come from. We already discussed how the Bible talks about things like satyrs, which are demon-possessed he-goats. We've already talked about some of the goat lore and how it tracks back to Azazel, who was the scapegoat in the Old Testament. And so we're seeing him continue on even in today's society. Remember, he's the god of perversion, and he likes to play his pan flute, and when he does so, he's able to mesmerize the children and lure them out of the town, and then of course he can have his way with them sexually and so on and so forth. And here's a picture of him over here on the right. Now, this is the hymn that Aleister Crowley wrote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there are some interesting details in here. On the fourth verse there, he talks about, to me, come with Apollo in the bridal dress, and he has the word shepherdess and pythoness. A pythoness is someone who has the spirit of Python, which we'll get into when we discuss that in the Bible. But the spirit of Python is basically the same thing as a spirit of divination. It's a supernatural spirit that's able to look into the past and to the future with high accuracy. As you continue on, in the middle there I've highlighted, come with flute and come with pipe. So we clearly see that he's talking about the same Pan that we had mentioned before, this character over here on the right who always has the pan flute. And later he says, with the lonely lust of devildom, give me the sign of the open eye. And so I'm not sure what that means, but I imagine it has to do with the third eye, which Crowley was obsessed with. It's the eye of Horus. It's the eye that allows people to open up the doorway between our world and the spirit realm. And then he goes on to say, and token erect of thorny thigh, and the word of madness and mystery, O Pan, O Pan, O Pan, O Pan, I am a man, do as thou wilt, as a great God can. That obviously comes from his Book of the Law that he channeled back in Cairo. And then he ends it with, and I rave, and I rape, and I rip, and I rend, everlasting world without end. So, I can think of a lot of things for you to read at my funeral, but one of them is not a hymn to the half-hybrid goat human God who's a god of sexual perversion and lust. So now we're going to move into another extremely interesting character by the name of Jack Whitesides Parsons. Jack Parsons was a very brilliant man. He was an American rocket engineer. He was the founder of JPL, Jet Proportions Laboratory. And he, along with von Braun, who was a Nazi, we'll discuss von Braun later, but I bring him up now because Jack Parsons and von Braun were basically two of the main fathers of rocketry. And they were two of the fathers who really helped propel NASA. Now, Jack Parsons was just an extremely interesting guy. He was very similar to Crowley in a lot of ways. First of all, he idolized Aleister Crowley. He was a heavy user of mind-altering drugs. He was an addict for sure. He was a closet homosexual. You'll learn that Crowley also was a homosexual. You'll learn that many of the occultists seem to have a lot of sexual identity confusion. He also suffered from manic depression. He was known to have manic episodes and be very bipolar. He was steeped in the occult, as much as Crowley ever was. This is a picture of him over here on the bottom right. This was a book that was written about him years ago called Strange Angel. It's an interesting title with the word angel in it. And you see the eyes beaming down on him. This is him holding a explosive. You'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner that there's an hourglass. And an hourglass is interesting. It symbolizes time, and it has to do with quantum physics and the disruption of the time-space barrier, which we'll get into later when we talk about the Hydrogen Collider and CERN. But that symbol's not there for just the heck of it. It has a meaning. If you slide over to the bottom left here, I'll highlight it here. Right here in purple, I'm circling it, you'll see a picture of the image of Kali, which I have over here on the left. Kali is one of the Hindu gods, the god of destruction. You can see Kali here standing on top of this person. And we're going to discuss Kali again later, also when we're talking about CERN, the Hydrogen Collider in Switzerland. But for now, the reason I bring it out is already we're seeing elements of Eastern mysticism. And I think we've seen from the previous lectures that these things just go hand in hand. And it's really going to play out in this presentation again. What's interesting is this guy, Jack Parsons, is such an interesting character that now in 2018 and 2019, they've decided to do a mini-series about him on CBS. And it's called The Strange Angel, based on a true story. And it's by Ridley Scott. And you'll notice at the top it says Sex, Magic, and Rocket Science. So, once again, I'm not making this stuff up. This guy is real, and everything that I'm about to reveal to you is real too. So at a young age, Jack Parsons joined Crowley's church, the Church of Thelema. And really, he thought of Crowley as a mentor or a father figure. Now, Jack came to believe in the reality of Thelema magic as a force that could be explained through quantum physics. This is a really interesting point. When you go back in time and you look at some of the famous occultists, like, for example, John Dee, who was the occultist who worked for the Queen of England in the 1500s. He was well versed in the occult and in magic, just as, for example, Eliphas Levi, who was in the 18th century. What separates those older times, those older occultists from the whole Dark Age and the Renaissance period, from the occultists of the 20th century is quantum physics. These guys now, the Crowleys and the Hubbards and the Jack Parsons of the world, these guys are very smart and intelligent men who are nuclear physicists and engineers, and they understand quantum mechanics and they understand quantum physics, and they realize that when you do a magic ritual, it's not literally just magic that's happening. there's actually quantum mechanics that are taking place on a cellular level, if you will, that are causing these things to manifest. And now that we are in an area where we understand quantum physics and quantum mechanics, they're beginning to learn the nuts and bolts of magic, if you will. And so we're going to get into the quantum physics a lot more later when we talk about CERN. Now you're going to hear me refer to CERN a lot. CERN is this huge 17-mile underground hydrogen collider that scientists have built and used. And it's a machine basically where they send two atomic particles at each other at the speed of light inside of a tube. And when they crash into each other, they open up a portal in the space-time dimension for one, and they also destruct into smaller particles so that these scientists can document this and see what these smaller particles are. And they continue to go further and further with these particles, because ultimately what they're pursuing is to find what's referred to as the God particle, or the singularity. The singularity is thought to be that moment when creation came into existence, that there was at one point in time there was this one small infinitesimal singular dot that someone struck a match and boom, let there be light, and that dot expanded, and there was quantum mechanics began, and through the explosion of an atom, a single molecule began to expand, and out of the ashes of that birthed, this whole universe. So they're trying that, these people believe in the Big Bang Theory, and they believe in quantum physics, which they should, because this science is real. And so they're trying to understand the origins of everything to do with cosmology. And so they're in pursuit of chasing that. And we're going to study that intently when we get to CERN, and we're going to see how occultic it is, how occultic the whole concept is, and how that's ultimately going to be used to open up a huge doorway later for something very dark that we'll get into later. But for now, we'll stay on point. So the point is that we're at a point here in the 40s where Parsons documented that magic isn't just happening on its own. It's quantum physics that's being manipulated here in order to facilitate the magic. Now in 45 he became roommates with none other than L. Ron Hubbard. For those of you who do not know Ron Hubbard, he was a man who created a system called Dianetics that would later become the Church of Scientology. And in 1946, Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons began working on what they called the Babylon Working Ritual. Now this is a ceremonial sex magic ritual between Hubbard and Parsons. Now the ritual was based on Crowley's previous Amalantra ritual. If you remember that was where Crowley and Roddy Minor got together in 1918 in an apartment in New York City, and they did a ritual, and they opened up, they said they tore a hole in the fabric of space-time, which allowed Lamb, the 3-foot gray Buddhist alien, to manifest into their apartment from a higher dimension. And so essentially Hubbard and Parsons, who have been studying Crowley's work very intently because they're part of this Thelema church, this cult if you will, they decided to basically take this same ritual if you will and reenact it, and probably added a little bit of their own spice to it. But their ultimate goal was to incarnate the spirit of Babylon, that is the scarlet whore of the book of Revelations. Because they believed that if they could open up a door and bring that entity in, the actual spirit of Babylon that's described in the book of Revelations, if they could bring that spirit into this realm and put that spirit inside of a woman, that they would then finally have the person who they could use to birth the Antichrist. And if they could bring about the Antichrist, then in their mind, they would have solidified this new age of Horus that was described to Crowley back in 1904, and that would bring about the end of Christianity and a new direction for mankind. Because you have to understand, they don't look at the Antichrist the way we look at the Antichrist. They literally look at the Antichrist as if he's truly a Messiah, that he's the same way that they look at Lucifer in the Garden of Eden, in that he illuminated mankind and revealed to them the tree of good and evil and made gods out of people. They're looking at the book of Revelations in the same way. They see Jesus Christ as the enemy, and they see the Antichrist as the good one. So they're obsessed with this notion of paving the way for the Antichrist, okay? So what's interesting is that almost immediately after their sex magic ritual was completed, Parsons is introduced to a woman, a red-haired woman by the name of Marjorie Cameron. And Parsons believed that she was a sign that the ritual worked and that she was a manifestation of Babylon. So now Parsons is looking at this woman, Marjorie Cameron, and he's thinking, wow, the ritual that we just did worked. The spirit of Babylon, the Babylon whore, was manifested into our four-dimensional time space and has taken up residence inside of this woman, Cameron. And so naturally then, what does he do? He begins doing sex magic rituals with Cameron with the hopes of impregnating her or another woman on this planet. So they begin doing something called a moonchild sex magic ritual. Now just hang with me here for a minute. We're almost done with the freaky stuff. This is based off of a book that we'll discuss in a moment that Crowley wrote. And so what they're trying to do here, Parsons is trying to impregnate Cameron with an ethereal being. Now, the word ethereal basically means the ether. That's the astral plane. When occultists talk about astral projecting, they're really talking about their spirit leaving their body, having an out-of-body experience, and traveling into the spirit realm or along the ethereal world or ethereal plane. And so we refer to that as the ether. So when it says here that they're trying to impregnate a woman with an ethereal being, that's a new age concept. The ether, really, it's just a demonic spirit is what they're bringing into this realm. Nonetheless, that was their goal, was to impregnate a woman. Now, immediately after the Moonchild rituals were over, Marjorie Cameron reported having a sighting of a UFO, which Parsons believed was a confirmation. He said that the UFO was the physical materialization of the spirit Babylon within our four-dimensional time space. I find that to be extremely interesting. Here we see again, there's this direct connection between UFOs and spirits, right? We're not talking about UFOs that are coming, that are from an intergalactic, they're traveling hundreds of thousands of light years in their spaceship, kind of like Star Trek, and eventually, these UFOs are then flying into our atmosphere and they're presenting ourselves. They're not intergalactic UFOs from many, many light years away, but they're interdimensional UFOs. They're UFOs that are coming from a higher dimension. And that's an extremely important distinction to understand because it confirms the spiritual nature of the UFO. So to try and summarize, Parsons and Cameron, based on Crowley's teachings, were performing sex magic rituals with the goal of opening a portal to a higher dimension by creating a tear in the fabric of space and time so that they could allow a spiritual entity into our plane of existence, specifically the scarlet whore, the whore of the book of Revelations, the whore of Babylon, so that if they could bring that spiritual entity into our plane of existence and put it into the vessel of a woman, that then later that woman could then be impregnated, and the baby that would be born would technically have the spirit of Babylon inside of that fetus, and then that would grow up to be this counterfeit Jesus Christ. And believe me, you can't make this stuff up. So, if you want to do your own research, Wikipedia is a great resource. Hop on there and type in the Babylon working ritual, do your own research, and you'll see that you can't make this stuff up. And I think as you continue through this lecture and you see all the different connection points, you'll realize that there is a super sophisticated spirit at work behind all of this. We have to understand these people are demonized. Aleister Crowley, Jack Parsons, Marjorie Cameron, Ron Hubbard, all these people have opened themselves up to the dark side, and now they've got these dark occult energies, and they've got these fallen angels and all these different things manifesting through them. They didn't just think this stuff up in the shower. They had entities who were speaking these things into their lives, and for all we know, this could be the mechanism by which the Antichrist will be born. We don't know. The Bible doesn't give us those kind of details, but it stands to reason that Satan will be working through humanity to try to precipitate this whole thing happening in the book of Revelations. And now we're getting some, first-hand intel on a bunch of occultists who are trying to manifest this. And they're not just doing some little backyards rituals. These are nuclear physicists and scientists who've figured out how to shatter the boundaries of space and time. In fact, later, they would say that one of the purposes of the Babylon ritual was to shatter the boundaries of space and time to help usher in the Eon of Horus. Here's a couple photos of Jack Parsons and Marjorie Cameron. So obviously they got their idea from Crowley. He wrote a book called Moonchild, and obviously this is a charged book. Everything that Crowley wrote was pretty much charged, because I don't think there's a day that went by that he wasn't in communication with some kind of higher spirit or entity. So, a lot of the ideas for these books are not coming directly from Crowley. They're coming from the spirit realm. So we're able to see here how what the spiritual side of things are up to. We're able to see what Satan and the fallen angels are up to. They need to find a way to bring about the spirit of Babylon. And so they worked through Crowley to write this book, Moonchild. Now this book is about a young woman who's seduced by a white magician by the name of Gray, like Gray Alien. And Gray persuades the woman into helping him in a magical battle with a black magician and his black lodge. So we have two different cults going on here, fighting each other. And Gray is attempting to save the human race by impregnating the girl with the soul of an ethereal being who will become the savior of mankind, the Moonchild. To achieve this, she'll have to be kept in a secluded environment, and many preparatory magic rituals will be carried out. So we're seeing how this is all playing out. That these entities are working through Crowley. He documented this book, Moonchild. The entities who had him do this knew that later they would be able to get someone to try and reenact this book, and then they could try and work through that whole situation to bring this about. So this is where Parsons and Cameron and Hubbard get their ideas for the Babylon working ritual. And again, we see this theme where Gray is attempting to save the human race by impregnating the girl with an ethereal being who will be the savior of mankind. In a way, the Bible talks very similarly about something just like that. In the last days, there is going to be an entity who is going to be birthed on this planet, who is going to represent a savior of mankind. He's going to be the false Messiah. We already have a savior of mankind. We already have Jesus Christ. And anybody who's studied the Bible and the prophecies of the Bible know that there are many, many prophecies about the coming of Jesus Christ the first time. You can go back in the Old Testament and you can learn from all of the Old Testament prophets, from Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and so forth, where they talk about this coming Savior who's going to, they say where he's going to be born, and they talk about details of how he's going to die and what he's going to accomplish through his death. And there are hundreds of prophecies that Jesus fulfills because he is the Messiah. But we're also told about this counterfeit Messiah that's going to come about in the last days. And that's who this cult of people are rooting for. They are trying to create a platform for this counterfeit Messiah. And this book here really stimulated a lot of it. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Marjorie Cameron because she's obviously a big participating factor in this whole movement. She's the one who's doing these rituals with Jack Parsons. Unfortunately, a few years later, Jack Parsons mysteriously dies in a laboratory in an explosion. And nobody knows exactly what happened. A lot of conspiracy was that he was murdered, but nobody can say for certain. Marjorie Cameron definitely believed that he was murdered. And so what we do know is we know what took place with Marjorie Cameron after she lost Jack Parsons. She started an occult group called the Children in 1952, which dedicated itself to sex magic rituals with men of different races with the intent of producing a breed of mixed race moon children who would be devoted to the god Horus Lucifer. So, that's pretty interesting there in itself. I mean, A, we know she's in the occult. B, she's continuing to do sex magic rituals with other men. C, she's interested with this mixture. We spent a lot of time in the first 6 lectures talking about, the definition of a bastard, right? The true definition of bastard was this mixed race, or this mixing of populations, this mixing of things that are human and things that are not human. And so she's not just interested with interbreeding different races, she's interested with interbreeding different races with moon children. So it's kind of almost like that weird hybridization thing that was going on before the flood. And of course, she's doing all this so that she can devote it to the god Horus, who we've already spent a lot of time talking about. We know that that's Satan and that's Lucifer. Crowley already confirmed this for us. She also began performing blood rituals in hope of communicating with Parsons' spirit. During these, she tried to commit suicide several times. She cut her own wrists. As part of these rituals, she claimed to have received a new magical identity known as Hilarion, which we'll discuss in a minute. When she learned that an unidentified flying object had been seen over Washington, D.C.'s Capitol building, she considered it a response to Parsons' death. So here we see it again. In the previous slide, when she saw a UFO, Jack Parsons was the one who said, hey, that must be the spirit of Babylon manifesting in this realm as a UFO. Now, later, after Parsons is dead and gone, she's learning about unidentified flying objects, and she's making the connection spiritually that it must be a response from Parsons' spirit, who she's doing blood rituals to communicate with. She also claimed that Mexico was about to conquer the United States and that a race war was about to break out in the old world, and that a comet would hit the earth, and that a flying saucer would rescue her and her followers and take them to Mars. That reminds me a lot of the cult group called Heaven's Gate. Some of you might remember them from the 90s. It's where the leader of the cult convinced about 30 people to take cyanide tablets and kill themselves because they believed that there was a spaceship behind Halley's Comet that would pick up their spirits. Once they died, they would release their spirits and they would float up into the atmosphere, and then this alien ship was going to pick them up and take them to another planet. We're going to get into a bunch of UFO religions later, but now I'm just trying to really kind of get back to the roots of some of this ufology. So here, Marjorie Cameron was saying that there were going to be all these cataclysmic things that were going to happen on the planet, and then they could, but that's okay because they would be able to hook up with a flying saucer and get taken to Mars. So you'll find, too, that a lot of the UFO religions are really heavily into the apocalyptic stuff, which we'll discuss later. In fact, ufology is, too. Many of the UFO alien abduction accounts, many of those people will tell you that they experienced images and visions in their abduction account that was very apocalyptic and last days oriented. And we'll discuss all that later. But, during her magic rituals, like the rest of them, she always used mind-expanding drugs, marijuana, peyote, magic mushrooms. Notice they call them magic because mushrooms were really That's when they really were being used, was for magic purposes, for astral projection and things like that. She would frequently try and commune with Jack Parsons' spirit through astral projection. So we got to remember, she's steeped in all the Eastern mysticism too. She knows how to go, empty herself and leave her body. She probably, I'm assuming, since Jack Parsons was so into Crowley, that he knew about Lamb, the 3-foot gray being, and they knew about the cult of Lamb and how to enter the egg and all of that. In 1957, Cameron moved to San Francisco and immersed herself in different bohemian social circles, and she began exploring the subject of ufology, and she became friends and roommates with movie producer Kenneth Anger and with ufologist George Van Tassel. We're going to discuss both of these guys in a minute. Also, she visited Kenneth Anger in San Francisco, where she became introduced and spent some time with Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. If you remember, there's this old kind of funny myth in Hollywood about, they call it the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, that basically, every movie, every actor in every movie can be at least 6 degrees or 6 connection points away from connecting to Kevin Bacon. Well, this video is going to be essentially the same thing, only it's not 6 degrees, it's more like 1 or 2 degrees, and it's going to be connection to Aleister Crowley and California and the Bay Area. We're about to discuss about 10 or 15 different people, from Charlie Manson and many others, and you're going to see this connectivity. So she's now in San Francisco. She's running with these bohemian circles, and she's spending time with people who are into ufology. Kenneth Anger is a movie producer. Now, she ends up starring in his movie called The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. Turns out that Kenneth Anger is also in the Church of Thelema, and he's a disciple of Crowley, and this movie has themes regarding Crowley and his religion. And so naturally, Marjorie Cameron plays the role of the Scarlet Woman of the Book of Revelations. You can't make this stuff up, by the way. You just can't. Interestingly enough, and unfortunately, she goes on to develop something called catalepsy, which is a central nervous system disorder causing muscular rigidity, loss of motor control, and epileptic symptoms, and eventually she died of a brain tumor. So the reason I included this is, well, first of all, we know that drugs will cause all kinds of central nervous system problems, but I just find it interesting that when you really study the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll see that many, not all, but many of the people that we're told accounts of Jesus healing were people that had neurologic issues. Many of the people that Jesus cast out demons from within them, the symptoms that they had were neurologic. It's almost like the ghost in the machine. If an entity is going to enter your body and it's going to be inside your vessel and it's going to be trying to control you, then obviously the way that it would work through your body would be through the electrical system, through the central nervous system. That's why we see Jesus healing people, for example, with seizures and epilepsy. We saw Jesus healing people with what was referred to as the palsy, which are people who had strokes and neurologic manifestations where they had drop foot and things like that. And we'll see that time and time again. Now, does that mean that every person that has a central nervous system disorder today is demonized? No, obviously not. There's all kinds of natural reasons for that. You could have had a traumatic brain injury and hit your head too hard, and now you've got an upper motor neuron lesion and you've got neurologic symptoms, okay? But I will tell you this, from studying the occult, from studying demonology for a long time, you will find that people who are highly demonized have all kinds of central nervous system disorders. They have all kinds of tics and all kinds of weird jerky movements, and they manifest different neurologic symptoms. And I believe, considering the fact that this woman was constantly astral projecting out of her body, she was constantly communicating with the dead and with all kinds of spiritual entities, and combining that with all the drugs, that all of this demonic manifestation in her life led to a complete breakdown of her central nervous system, and she eventually died of a brain tumor, which is also central nervous system related. Now, if you remember in the previous slide, she was doing blood rituals and cutting her own arms, her own wrists to try and connect with Jack Parsons' dead spirit. And it's at that time that she was given, that means that it was dictated to her from someone else, right? It was channeled, but she was given a new magical identity known as Hilarion. Well, the only other time that we see Hilarion manifest out there in history is one of the ascended masters who we already discussed. In Tibet, the ancient masters of wisdom, which there's a bunch of them, we discussed this before. Buddha, they say Jesus was one, and all of these others, El Moira, but you'll see here on the bottom middle right is Hilarion. She was an ascended master. So I think that Cameron was obviously communicating with these higher level spirits, and they communicated with her that now she was going to be initiated into the fifth or sixth initiation, and she was becoming an ascended master herself, and she was beginning to take on this persona that she was Hilarion. So after Marjorie passed away of brain cancer, this is the portrait that she painted, and these were the portraits that were displayed at her funeral. On the right, you see an image of Jack Parsons. And what I find fascinating about it is these people are always bringing up angels. You just see a lot of angel iconography within this whole thing. We started off showing the books about Jack Parson, and it says on the cover, Strange Angel. Now you have Marjorie Cameron, who, when she passes away, they took a portrait that she painted. By the way, she was a famous artist. And a lot of her art reminds me of Nicholas Roerich in a way, very bizarre and kind of deep and weird. And I think that most of her art was channeled, just as we had discussed, most of his art was channeled because she clearly had muses and spirit guides to stimulate her in that regard. But I don't think it was an unnatural thing for her to paint Jack Parsons as an angel. Here you see him as a black angel of death, and he's got angel wings. And I really think that this goes back to these fallen angels and these demonic spirits who are masquerading as these ancient ascended masters and all these different things. They're also, all these ascended masters are also masquerading as lamb, these UFO occupants and so on. Now what's interesting is obviously there's some hidden meaning here because Marjorie Cameron drew this picture of herself holding a black egg. And clearly this in all my studies, I haven't been able to find a connection to anything else other than the egg of spirit that Crowley had invented, right? Crowley's the one who invited Lamb into our atmosphere. Kenneth Grant later started the cult of Lamb. And so I'm pretty certain that this has to be connected to that. But look at the similarities between this and Lady Gaga's new perfume in the black egg. I think that's interesting. I mean, you got to have quite an imagination to think of all the things you can think of, but an egg and a black one, no less. So I think there's a lot of commonality in there. And we already showed, some footage of Lady Gaga doing the rebirth of the egg, and I'm certain that she's a Crowley follower. So, there's another connection there. Now, the presentation is going to start getting very confusing, so just try and hang with me. I'm going to try and connect all the dots as we go, and I'll probably be saying some of the same things over and over because I'm trying to just keep it all connected because I even get confused. But basically, Marjorie Cameron moved to San Francisco and she started hanging out with interesting people like Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan and movie producers like Kenneth Anger. So it's important to figure out who Kenneth Anger is. Well, it turns out that Kenneth Anger is part of the Church of Crowley. He's part of the Thelema. And he was a Hollywood filmmaker whose movies merged surrealism with homoeroticism and the occult. And once again, you'll see this recurrent theme of people who are in the occult, people who are into magic, people who are into witchcraft. A lot of these guys, Crowley was bisexual, Jack Parsons was homosexual and bisexual, Ron L. Hubbard was bisexual, Kenneth Anger, his movies were about homoeroticism. So you just keep seeing this same theme over and over and over. But he joined Crowley's Church of Thelema in the 40s, and he directed several cult classics. One of them is called Invocation of My Demon Brother. And when you just think about the terminology there, we already know that invocation is a word that's only used in witchcraft and magic to invoke a spirit. And then his second movie that he produced was Lucifer Rising. And obviously, we know who he's talking about here. What's interesting is that these movies involve many famous musicians such as Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Jimmy Page. And it also starred Anton LaVey, who was the man who wrote the Satanic Bible in San Francisco in the 60s and who started the official church called the Church of Satan. So, we begin to see, some of the rock and roll genres, if you will, are immersed in some of this stuff, and we'll get into that later. But Lucifer Rising was about Kenneth Anger's Thelemite beliefs about the emerging eon of Horus as prophesied in the sacred text, the Book of the Law. So obviously, we talked about this before. Kenneth Anger, he was never, he was never a Christian. He never accepted Christ. Therefore, he never had the Holy Spirit. If you don't have the Holy Spirit and you start dabbling in this stuff, then guess what? That spirit in that text is going to have power over you, and you're going to take it hook, line, and sinker. This is exactly what happened to Kenneth Anger. He became totally, encompassed in all of this to the point where in 1966 he actually tattooed the name of Lucifer upon his chest. And you can see a picture of him when he was young with the tattoo, and you can see a picture of him when he was old with the tattoo. And he began searching for a young man who could symbolically play Lucifer in the film Lucifer Rising. He eventually chose a roommate of his, Bobby Beausoleil, for the role. Now, some of you may recognize the name Bobby Beausoleil. And if you do, it's because he had a lot of press time because he was part of the Manson family and he was indicted for murder. And we're going to get into that in a minute. So, Beausoleil was a musician. He founded a band called the Magic Powerhouse of Oz. And the Magic Powerhouse of Oz was basically the group that recorded all the music for Kenneth Anger's movies that he produced. So in 1967, Kenneth Anger befriended Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, members of the Rolling Stones, and Anger then decided to use much of the footage created for Lucifer Rising in his new film, Invocation of My Demon Brother, which starred Bobby Beausoleil. This movie also starred Anton LaVey, Jaggers, and Richards. So these guys, not only did the Rolling Stones produce the music for the film Invocation of My Demon Brother and Lucifer Rising, but they also starred in the movies. And Anger starred in them as well. In fact, he was the Magus, the magician in the movies. So, it was released in 1969 and explored many of the Thelemic themes. And you know what? We've all heard the Rolling Stones. I mean, they've got some amazing songs, and we're going to discuss some of those songs later. And, if you're a big Rolling Stones fan, all I'm trying to do here is I'm just trying to reveal to you the truth. I'm trying to reveal to you the origin and the source of many things, including a lot of music. Does that mean that every musician's evil? No, it doesn't mean that. There's a lot of great musicians who are not evil. However, as you're going to see, and if you do your own independent research, you're going to find that most of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll movement was all inspired by the Book of the Law, by people like Aleister Crowley, people like Kenneth Anger, and people like the Rolling Stones. They got swept up in it just like everybody else. They were rich, they were famous, they were all on mind-altering drugs. It was during an era of the 60s. It was during an area of, the hippie movement and free love and rebellion against everything, including Christianity. And so is it any wonder that a young Mick Jagger or Keith Richards would get hooked up with these people and start doing drugs and fall into all this and then make music? It's not shocking at all. So one of the better songs out there When you listen to this song, it really has an amazing tune. It's one of those jams. As soon as it comes on the radio, you find yourself, moving your head and wanting to move to the words. I used to listen to this song probably 10 years ago. I had no idea what the words were. I would just kind of lip sync it and go along with it. And so I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. I want to sing it, but my wife tells me I'm a horrible singer and that I need to keep my day job, so I probably won't. I'll try not to get sucked into singing it. But it's the Symphony for the Devil, written by the Rolling Stones in the 1960s. Ended up being one of the major hits of that entire decade. You can see the cover album over here on the top right, the Symphony for the Devil. And it goes, please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I've been around for a long, long year, stole many a man's soul and faith. And I'll continue on. And just think about these lyrics. I was around when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain, made damn sure that Pilate washed his hands and sealed his fate. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name. But what's puzzling you is the nature of my game. I stuck around St. Petersburg when I saw it was a time for change. I killed the Tsar and his ministers. Anesthesia screamed in vain. This is in reference to the Bolshevik Revolution that happened in the early 1900s during the rise of communism in Russia. The Romanov family was the Tsar Nicholas II and his wife and 5 children, where the Bolsheviks stormed their house and murdered all 5 of them and stabbed them to death with bayonets, including their youngest daughter, who you see in the middle right there, called Anastasia. And so here he's writing a song portraying the devil, that the devil is saying that I was around, and Anastasia screamed in vain. Continuing on, I rode a tank, held a general's rank, when the Blitzkrieg raged and the bodies stank. The Blitzkrieg was obviously from the Nazis, and this is a reference to Adolf Hitler, and this is a reference to all of the millions of Jews and gypsies who were tossed in the incinerators. I'm pleased to meet ya. Hope you guess my name. Oh yeah. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. Oh yeah, I watched with glee as your kings and queens fought for 10 decades for the gods they made. He's talking about all the false religions and all the wars that that the devil propagated over false religions. I shouted out who killed the Kennedys when after all it was you and me. So let me introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I laid traps for troubadours who get killed before they reach Bombay. This is the troubadours were groups of people who meandered around places like Pakistan and India and throughout the Middle East and different areas. And there was an Indian cult called the Thuggees. And it's a Sanskrit term that means swindler or deceiver. And Thuggees is a Hindu word where we get the word thug. So today when you say that, the guy's a punk or a thug, this is the origin of that word. Thuggees were a group of people who used to masquerade as innocent people on the side of the road so that when caravans came by, they would jump them, take everything they had, kill them all, and steal the loot and the booty. And so this is a picture of them in the bottom right-hand corner. This is a portrayal of Thuggee. If you were to Google Thuggee, you can read all about them. They were all around, Eastern cultures and things for hundreds of years. And it shows a picture of them, pulling a guy off a horse, and they're going to beat him up and kill him and take his money. Now, they worship the god Kali, which we've already talked about once before, right? We see Kali earlier on the cover of Strange when seeing Jack Parsons. And we're going to see Kali emerge later when we talk about the Hydrogen Collider CERN. But that's a picture of Kali right there in the bottom corner. So pleased to meet you. Hope you guessed my name. So here he is saying, I hope you've guessed who I am by now. And obviously we know who it is. This is the devil. But what's puzzling you is the nature of my game.
Just as every cop is a criminal and all sinners are saints, as heads is tails, just call me Lucifer, 'cause I'm in need of some restraint. This is the law of reversal that we're going to discuss in a minute. That everything is opposite in Satan's eyes. Good is evil, light is really dark. As heads is tails. He's saying that what you would call heads, he would call tails, and what he would call tails, you would call heads, because he does everything reversed. And we'll get into the law of reversal in a minute. Because I'm in need of some restraint. So if you meet me, have some courtesy, have some sympathy, and have taste. Use all your well-learned politesse, or I'll lay your soul to waste. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name. So he's basically threatening us and saying, hey, don't cross me, because if you do, I'm going to come after your soul. So this is the song that the Rolling Stones sang in the 60s when they were totally immersed in Crowleyism, when they were hanging out with Kenneth Anger, making songs like Lucifer Rising and The Invocation of My Demon Brother, when they were under mind-altering drugs. And you can guarantee that this was a channeled and charged song that probably came right from Satan himself. And one thing you'll learn about Satan's music, it is highly catchy tune. When you listen to it, you just can't help but move your head and move to the music because it's mesmerizing. We're going to see that time and time again. We're going to go through a lot of music later, some really amazing songs that you just find yourself drawn to. And when you study Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, there are verses in there that talk about Lucifer before he fell, when he was still the anointed covering cherub. And it says specifically that he was in charge of the tablets and the pipes. And when you look those words up, you see that those are stringed instruments, and pipes refers to horned instruments. And the conclusion that we come to is that Lucifer was in charge of the morning star administration that took place in heaven. He was in charge of worship, and he's very familiar with music. And so is it any wonder that when he fell, he decided that he would use music as one of his vehicles to lead people astray? And I think we're seeing a great example of it here.
For those who don't know the true gospel of Jesus Christ, and they're listening to this song, it gives them the wrong interpretation here. Here the lyrics say, and I was around when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain, made damn sure that Pilate washed his hands and sealed his fate. You want to talk about a blasphemous verse to include in a song? This is exactly like the devil to try and rewrite the story and do it in such a way that puts him in a position of power, as if he's the one who was pulling all the strings. We know he's a puppet master. We know that he's pulling strings on lots of people. He was pulling the strings on the Rolling Stones to get them to do what they were doing. He was pulling the strings on Aleister Crowley to get him to do what he was doing. Marjorie Cameron, Jack Parsons, and many others. But, in that situation, Jesus was in complete control of every detail within the gospel. Yes, the night before at the Garden of Gethsemane, he was in severe pain. So much so that it says in the Gospel of Luke that he actually sweat drops of blood, which is a true medical condition. Basically, when you have so much anxiety and the fight or flight system is kicked in to the point where your adrenal glands are dumping tremendous amounts of epinephrine and adrenaline into your bloodstream, those cause high blood pressure, and they cause the capillaries, if the pressure gets high enough, the capillaries can rupture and you can leak blood out of your tissues. So, and I find it interesting that the only person who documented that in the Gospels was Luke, who's the physician. He's the only one medically who would think to include that detail because he has that medical knowledge. But, I wanted to comment here that, to the person who doesn't know the gospel, they may listen to this song and think, oh, pleased to meet you, I hope you guessed my name. They think, oh, this song's about the devil and it's a cool song, and and he obviously is the one who
had Jesus crucified, but that is absolutely not the real story. Jesus was in complete control of that entire situation. At any given moment, Jesus could have called down 12 legions of angels and finished the whole thing. But instead, he did the will of his Father, and he went to the cross, and he drank the cup of his indignation, full strength, as it says in the scripture, for every single person on this planet. And so, I just find it's interesting that the enemy, works through music like this and has brought these lyrics out through the Rolling Stones to insinuate that he was in control. So here's some of the clips from Kenneth Anger's movie Invocation of My Demon Brother that starred the Rolling Stones. They wrote all the music for this film. You can see in the bottom left, that's a picture of Anton LaVey in a satanic suit holding a skull. And, if you follow it over to the right, it shows this weird head, like a zombie head. Zap, you're pregnant. That's witchcraft. And the whole movie has just a lot of weird symbolism and a lot of satanic weird stuff. It's just a bizarre film. And just to demonstrate the power of the Book of the Law, Crowley wrote that in 1904, and here we are in the 1960s, basically 60 years later, and people are still falling into this. On the left, if you remember Kenneth Anger and Bobby Beausoleil, they made a band called the Magic Powerhouse of Oz, and that was the band that made all the music for these films. And here you can see on the left a brochure, The Bringers of Light, and the Straight Theater present. This is a show that took place in San Francisco down on Haight Street. You remember Haight-Ashbury, where the drug and the hippie craze used to be. Oddly enough, I used to hang out on Haight-Ashbury when I lived in San Francisco for 4 years. We used to go down to Haight-Ashbury all the time. That's back before I was saved. That's back before I knew Jesus. I wish I could go back there now, knowing what I know now. But anyway, what we see here is at the top left, you see the Bringers of Light. We know that Lucifer is the light bearer. Then we see the Equinox of the Gods, and we see the Eye of Horus, which is the same eye that's on our dollar bill. And then we see the Magic Powerhouse of Oz by Kenneth Anger. And to the left, we see a picture of Horus with a falcon-headed god, and above him is a 666 with a snake wrapped around it. And then over on the bottom right, we see this interesting guy kneeling down, plucking music to Satan, and he's got a little depiction of Satan on the end of his harp there. And if you look around, if you look over to the right here, or in the center actually, you'll see the Steel of Revealing. Notice the similarities here. I'm pretty sure that when Kenneth Anger made this, he did a replica of it, because if you look at the Steel of Revealing here, you'll see this image of a woman who's wrapped around right here. And now look at the image on the left. You'll see right here, if you follow, it wraps right around. It kind of has that same look to it. And so this is kind of like a knockoff of the Steel of Revealing. And then over here on the right, you have the Complete Magic Tantrum Cycle and the Magic Powerhouse of Oz. This is one of their covers of their album. And what do you see? Well, you see Egyptology, because obviously they all love Horus to death, and they're steeped in Egyptology. So you've got a picture of the Sphinx on the front inside of a pyramid. We've already discussed the occult symbolism of a triangle and a pyramid. But notice what's above his head, but none other than a flying saucer, a UFO. And so this is what I've been trying to say for a long time, is that the ufology movement, it's all steeped in Eastern mysticism, the New Age movement, black magic, the occult. That's what it's about. And so we know it's from the dark side, and we know that the dark side's going to use that later to try and fool us all. And we'll get into that later. So here on the left, you see Lucifer Rising, a film by Kenneth Anger, written by Bobby Beausoleil. Part of the Manson family, because Manson family lived in the San Francisco area during the 70s. All these guys ran around together. Anton LaVey, the Church of Satan, who was friends with guys like Sammy Davis Jr. and the Rat Pack. His girlfriend was the famous movie actress Janie Mansfield. I mean, one of the most famous actresses of the 60s was in the Church of Satan with Anton LaVey. Anton LaVey starred in these movies. He was hanging around on the set with the Rolling Stones, and all these different people who were part of that era. So here on the right is a picture of Bobby Boussalet's band, and you can see above his head is the 666. And then here is an image of one of the records, and you can see there's a picture of Bobby Boussalet on the left, and I zoomed in on that and blew it up, and look what's on the door. Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. So all of these songs, the movies, the music, the ideology, it all dates back to Aleister Crowley and the book that was channeled to him from basically the great Egyptian pyramid of Giza. Are you now being able to see the supernatural sophistication of this spirit, this evil spirit who's the god of this world, who's working and moving through all these different people? These people really don't have any idea what they've got a hold of. They're just pawns. We're not here. I feel sorry for them. They never learn the truth. If they would have spent even a fraction of the time that they spent in all of the book of the law and all this occultism, if they'd have spent a fraction of that time just trying to learn about the Bible and open their hearts to the Lord, then the Holy Spirit would have been able to preserve them and protect them from all this. But you know what? They didn't do that. They chose to go down the left-hand path, and once you go down that direction, it's pretty rough. Now, it's never too late to come out of it. There are many amazing testimonies that I've seen and read and heard from many people who've come out of Satanism and the occult, because the one in us is greater than the one in the world. But most of these people did not come out of it. They got taken all the way down through it, including Bobby Boussalet. You think when Bobby Boussalet was making this music that he had any idea a couple of years later that he would be stabbing people to death as part of the Manson family and spend his life in prison? So, there's an old proverb in the Bible: bad company corrupts good morals. Continuing on with Kenneth Anger, he joined Thelema in 1944. If you look at some of his early work, I find it really fascinating. One of the first short films he made in the 1940s was called A Prisoner of Mars, and it was a science fiction program about the Greek mythological myth of the Minotaur. Now that's a very odd subject matter to do one of your first films on. But yet, here's this guy who's steeped in the occult, steeped into Crowleyism and Satanism, who just so happens to be really fascinated with concepts such as the Minotaur. Well, we already discussed the Minotaur. There were Minotaurs running around this planet at one time. The entire Genesis 6 conspiracy took place. And we're still seeing the fruit of that thousands of years later. It's burned into our DNA. It's burned into our consciousness. It's burned into our psyche. That's why when Kenneth Anger opened up the door to some of this thelema and some of these concepts, he was inspired to make films about it. For example, the Minotaur. His next film project he initially called Demigods. And so we're going to see, we're trying to put this all in context of round one, the first 6 chapters that we did about what happened before the flood. It's not a coincidence that Kenneth Anger is making movies about minotaurs and demigods, and that Aleister Crowley is writing songs to the hybrid Pan, and that Baphomet is the half-human, half-goat who's on the label of the Church of Satan for Anton LaVey. That's not all a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that Marjorie Cameron put together a cult group called The Children, where she tried to mix moon children spirits with mixed races of humans. This is all woven within us at a deeper level. In 1954, he produced the movie called The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which featured many Crowleyan and Thelemite themes, with many of the various characters personifying pagan gods such as Isis, Osiris, Pan, Aphrodite, etc. So, these guys were just obsessed with all of that folklore and mythology, which, as we've shown previously, is based in a kernel of truth. So the 1960s brought the hippie scene, and Anger began using LSD, and he re-released this movie, Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, but he retitled it as The Sacred Mushroom Edition. And in the early and mid-60s, LSD was legal. So many people were going into theaters, they were dropping LSD, and then they were watching this really deep, occultic, sadistic movie that was totally immersed in Crowley themes. And sure enough, they all got into it hook, line, and sinker, and this helped drive and push that hippie movement. It didn't just come out of a vacuum. It had a source, there was a spirit behind it, and there was a mechanism by which it grew and flourished and developed. And this is one of the guys. This is a famous movie director who's part of the Church of Thelema, who worships and loves Aleister Crowley, and he literally made demonic movies called Lucifer Rising that have a bunch of Crowleyan themes in it, and people were taking LSD and watching these in the movies across the United States of America. So with Anger's growing fame, he became associated with many celebrities, including Anton LaVey, who we've discussed. Turns out that Anton LaVey named Kenneth Anger as his godfather of his daughter Xena. Now here on the bottom left, I have a picture of Marjorie Cameron. She was Jack Parsons' woman, the one that did the Babylon working ritual and the Moonchild rituals with Ron L. Hubbard, the father of Scientology, the one that was trying to incarnate the Babylon whore. So this is pictures of her in that movie, and you can see how weird it is. Then on the right, I included a picture of Anton LaVey, and then I included his daughter. Now his daughter, she obviously was raised in all of this, so she's steeped in all of the magic arts. After Anton LaVey died, she more or less ran the Church of Satan until 1990, and then she came to her senses. She severed ties with her father. She severed ties with the church. She renounced the whole thing. But then she changed to Buddhism and is now a teacher of Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. So basically she jumped from the pot to the frying pan, because we know that it's the same spirit, it's just a different system. It's layered, you know. You think to yourself, oh, good for her. She got out of the Church of Satan, and now she's teaching Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. That means that she's doing all the same things that the Church of Satan were doing. She's still into the occult. She's still into the Eastern mysticism. She's still communicating with the demons that are masquerading as ascended masters, and so it hasn't really served her all that well. So here are some album covers with Kenneth Anger's films, Lucifer Rising. And in this situation, we see Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. So sorry for all you guys who are big fans. You know, first I bust on the Rolling Stones. If you remember earlier in one of the earlier presentations, you've got, oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name, Ozzy Osbourne. Remember, he was in a band called Black Sabbath? Think about that for a second. The word Sabbath comes from the Bible. Black Sabbath was a very blasphemous group, and Ozzy Osbourne was a huge Crowley supporter. That's why he wrote the song called Mr. Crowley. I'm not going to sing it this time, but you know, and I would challenge each of you, when these songs come up, just hit pause and get on your phone and pull them up so that you can hear them. So next time you hear them, you'll recognize them, and you can be able to kind of pick up on the tunes of the enemy and the kind of music that he produces. But here, so Kenneth Anger, he becomes good friends with Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page, and Jimmy Page was a huge Crowley follower, so much so that he actually purchased Crowley's former residence in Loch Ness, Scotland. This place was called the Boleskine House, and this is in the same area where we heard of the Loch Ness Monster. So I find that's an interesting link there. Who knows, maybe Crowley had something to do with that too. But anyway, Kenneth Anger came to live with Jimmy Page and his wife at the Boleskine House in Scotland, but apparently there was some kind of falling out between Anger and Jimmy's wife, and so Kenneth Anger got kicked out. Well, in retaliation, Anger called a press conference in which he ridiculed Page and threatened to, quote, throw a Kenneth Anger curse on him. I thought that was interesting because, you know, Kenneth Anger is a magus. It's clear that he is. He even plays one in the movies. And so the fact that he's using this quote that I'll throw a Kenneth Anger curse on you, he means that. Page's music was then dumped from the film and replaced in 1979 by none other than Bobby Boussolet, who was in prison at the time. So Here on the left, while Kenneth Anger and Jimmy Page were still buddies, you see the album cover Lucifer Rising with Jimmy Page's name at the bottom, and also in the middle, this is another album for Lucifer Rising where you see Jimmy Page himself holding the Steel of Revealing. Now here you can't see it because it's all blocked out, but I'll show it here in a few slides. It's actually Jimmy Page looking into the mirror at the face of Aleister Crowley holding the Steel of Revealing. Now, of course, later, after they have the falling out, Kenneth Anger cuts Jimmy Page's name off of the albums, and he lets Bobby Beausoleil put his music on there, and so you'll see Lucifer Rising to the right with Bobby's name on it. So it's pretty interesting story. But in these films, Kenneth Anger always plays the Magus, and these films are all based on Thelema. That mankind had entered a new period known as the Aeon of Horus. That's what Lucifer Rising is about. It was completely stimulated and imagined based on Crowley's writings. So you could say that this is a charged movie. All of this stuff, including the music that was produced for it, is all charged by the enemy. So continuing on, we're going to move on to Bobby Beausoleil. So, in 1967, as we mentioned previously, Kenneth Anger hired Bobby to star in the film Lucifer Rising. He was to symbolize Lucifer. And it was at this time that Bobby had also met Charles Manson and become associated with the communal group known as the Manson family. And so later on, Manson had convinced Beausoleil to kill a man named Hinman and to make it look as if the Black Panthers had done it as part of Manson's ideology that a race war was imminent and part of what he called Helter Skelter, which he received from listening to the Beatles' White Album. So it's starting to get complicated now because there's so many players involved. But essentially, and we'll discuss the Beatles in a minute, but if you recall, I mentioned earlier that the Beatles went to India in 1968 and somewhere in the 60s, and they took a course on transcendental meditation, and while they were over in India smoking hashish, they wrote the lyrics for many of the songs on the White Album, including Helter Skelter. And then later, the Mansons were taking mind-altering drugs and listening to that charged music, and Charles Manson claims that he received a message that was an apocalyptic message about a race war that was coming and how they needed to start killing people and doing sacrifices for, quote, God, right? And so now we're seeing the fruit of that later when he puts when he's able to manipulate. You got to understand, Charles Manson was a master manipulator. He was just like the devil. He was able to manipulate entire groups of people. All cult leaders are amazing at doing that. They're given a supernatural power to a power of divination where they can actually mesmerize and enchant people. And I think it's through witchcraft. I think that they put a curse on someone and they hex them. They put a spell on these people. So that's exactly what Charles Manson did. Bobby Beausoleil has opened himself up to all this garbage because he's writing these lyrics for these movies like Lucifer Rising. He's involved with people like Kenneth Anger. He's joined the Church of Thelema, so he's obviously fresh and ready to be manipulated. And then boom, he jumps in, with the Manson family, and now Charles Manson, being this high-level mesmerizer, is able to put a spell on Beausoleil. So the next thing you know, Bobby Beausoleil and Susan Atkins stabbed Hinman to death. Now it says that Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death while Hinman, a devotee of Buddhism, repeated a Buddhist chant. Think about that for a second. That was actually discussed in the courtroom. They said that he went into a chant where he tried to empty himself while he was being stabbed. So that tells you the power of the Eastern mysticism in his life. And then as Hinman lay dying in court, they testified that Beausoleil and Susan Atkins took turns smothering him with a pillow until he died. Now Susan Atkins, she's the woman here in the middle down below who's kind of smirking at Charles. She's the one who would later help kill Sharon Tate Roman Polanski's baby, Roman Polanski's wife and her baby, which we'll go to next. So I'm trying to keep it all straight. Um, After they killed Hinman, Bousselet wrote the words "political piggy" on a wall in Hinman's blood in an attempt to lead police to believe that the murder was done by a group of radicals. He then dipped his hand in Hinman's blood and left a paw print attempting to symbolize the Black Panthers as a way of misleading the investigators. So these guys are just obviously about as sadistic as they get. Now, according to the LA District Attorney's Office, this slaying became the first in a series of murders committed by the Manson family that set in motion the helter-skelter scenario that Manson envisioned and preached would happen in the near future. So accompanying Bousselet that night were Susan Atkins and Mary Broomer. And then 18 months later, Susan Atkins would accompany Tex Gordon in the infamous Tate LaBanca murders. So, once again, we're connecting Aleister Crowley, who was, Kenneth Anger worshipped Crowley to the point where he made films and music all about Crowley. Bobby Bousselet worshipped Crowley and even starred in these films. And then we're seeing Bobby Bousselet as part of the Manson family, and he and Susan Atkins murdered this man named Hinman. And then later Susan Atkins goes and ends up murdering Polanski's wife and baby. So we're going to see the connection there in just a moment. And before I move on, bottom left is a picture of Bobby Bousselet. Far right is a picture of Charles Manson with obviously a swastika on his forehead. He did that because of the Nazi movement, but I think it's deeper than that too, because if you remember, Adolf Hitler got that Nazi symbol from Eastern mysticism through Hinduism, because it's originally a Hindu symbol, and I have pictures later where we'll show ancient pictures of Buddha and the Hindu gods wearing these swastikas. And so I'm pretty sure that Charles Manson was also into the Eastern mysticism, and so I think that the swastika probably has multiple layers of meaning to people like that. It means Nazism and the whole genetic, Aryan thing, but then and above and beyond that, it also has the Eastern mystical meaning.
All right, guys, for those of you who don't like math, don't worry, this isn't going to be too hard of an equation. But basically, if A plus B equals C, then guess what? A plus C also equals B. What does that mean? That means that like hangs with like. You see packs of coyotes hanging out with packs of coyotes. You see prides of lions. You see certain birds hanging out with other birds. I mean, this is just the nature of things. People and animals and creation tend to flock to their own kind. So it's not a coincidence, We've got Kenneth Anger, who's making, some of the most horrific films in the world. He lives with Bobby Bousselet, and Bobby ends up taking on the role of Lucifer. And then, Bobby also ends up joining the Manson family. That shouldn't be a shocker. And so, Bobby seems to be the tie between Kenneth Anger and the Mansons. The point I'm trying to make is you can guarantee that they all know each other. They're all running together. These people are up late at night partying. They're all part of occult groups. They're doing God knows what kind of rituals and things like that. So all of these characters that I'm going to begin to unravel as we go forward, they're all interconnected. Okay, guys, let's continue on. So we're going to weave another group of people into this whole madness. Roman Polanski, he's the guy you see on the far right. He's a famous movie producer and writer and director, and that was his beautiful wife, Sharon Tate. Now, Polanski, he's living in the same area. He's hanging out with the same group of people. He knew the Manson family. He was friends and colleagues with Kenneth Anger, who was the other Hollywood producer who produced Lucifer Rising, etc. He just happens to come up with this idea for a film called Rosemary's Baby. Now, I think, based on everything we've read so far, we know where this idea came from. I don't think he just woke up one day and said, hey, I'm going to go ahead and make a movie about, birthing the Antichrist. This was a theme that was being propagated through Crowleyism. That was Crowley's goal, and this guy is highly connected to that whole world. So either one of these people like Kenneth Anger spoke this into his life, or one of these entities that they were communicating with inspired it. But nonetheless, this guy decides to create a film called Rosemary's Baby, which is about a woman who gets pregnant by her husband, and she doesn't realize that her husband has made a pact with a satanic cult to basically sacrifice the child in order to further his career as a movie actor. And so this is almost like life imitating art, if you will, because this whole thing ends up kind of playing out in a similarly sadistic way. You know, Rosemary's Baby, which we just hit the 50th year anniversary of it. Here's a movie about Satanism. Here's a movie about birthing the Antichrist, and it ends up gaining universal acclaim from film critics. It won numerous nominations and awards, and today is considered one of the greatest American horror films ever. So there's a great point. This goes to show you already the breakdown of the things in America when in the 1960s they're glorifying a movie about Satan birthing the Antichrist. That kind of tells you how far we've come even back then. But what's really awful is that a little over a year after Roman Polanski made this movie, and by the way, this was his big breakout moment, kind of like in the movie Rosemary's Baby, once the actor in the movie joins the cult, then all of a sudden he starts getting all kinds of roles, and his career is beginning to be projected forward. We kind of see the same thing here. Once Roman Polanski produces this movie and gets all these nominations, now he becomes a big Hollywood elite movie producer. But a year later, in August of 1969, Sharon Tate, which is Roman Polanski's wife, and 5 others were murdered by members of the Manson family. This time it was Tex Watson and Susan Atkins. And if you remember, Susan Atkins was the one who joined Bobby Beausoleil in smothering and killing a man by the name of Hinman. So this is not her first time. And this all took place in movie producer Roman Polanski's house. And of course, Sharon Tate was pregnant at 8.5 months pregnant, which means her baby was literally a week or literally a matter of a couple of days of coming out. For any of you who have children, I remember what it was like when my wife was 8.5 months pregnant. I mean, the baby was moving so much. I mean, it's completely formed at this point. All it needs to do is just exit the womb, and it's into the world. And so at the time of her death, she was 8.5 months pregnant with their son. When one of the victims asked them who he was and what he was doing there, Tex Watson replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." Tate pleaded to be allowed to live long enough to give birth to her son. At this point, Atkins and Watson stabbed Tate and her baby to death 16 times. And it was documented in the court trial later. Watson said that while they were killing Sharon Tate, she cried, "Mother, mother." So, this is just hard to even conceive of, but this is a real event that took place. And then, later, well, actually the next day, earlier, as the 4 family members, the Manson family members, were heading back out to Spawn Ranch, which is where Manson and the Manson family lived. Manson had told them to leave a sign, something witchy. And notice that word witchy, because these people are not just a bunch of acid dropping, junkies. They're witches. They're into the occult. They're into a bunch of satanic stuff. So Susan Atkins took the blood from Sharon Tate and her dead baby, and she wrote the words "pig" on the house in front of in Tate's blood on the front door. And then the next day, Charles Manson actually participated with the same group in the killing of the LeBlanca family. So, this is just an insane account here, and you can clearly see the manifestation of this whole thing. That Charles Manson is the one who claims to have received a message from the Beatles, and he was into a lot of occult stuff. and he was connected with Kenneth Anger, and he was Charles Manson was a Crowley follower. So we're now beginning to see the fruit of Crowley downstream, 60 years later. But what I thought was interesting is, Sharon Tate, she had starred in a film in 1966 called The Eye of the Devil. And in this movie, David Niven plays the owner of a vineyard who's called back to the estate when it falls on hard times. Accompanied by his wife, Deborah Kerr, the couple are confronted by a beautiful witch by the name of Sharon Tate. So Sharon Tate played this role as a witch who also lived on the estate with her brother, and as time passes by, it becomes clear that a blood sacrifice will be expected to return the vineyard to its former glory. And the reason I bring this up is, there's nobody deserves what happened to these people. I mean, nobody deserves to die this horrible death. This is just an absolute, disgusting horror. But when you look, we sometimes invite these things into our life. I've already said that the Bible teaches that bad company corrupts good morals. Whoever you're rubbing elbows with, they'll rub back and they'll rub off on you. And there's an old saying that the company you keep is the trouble you meet. And so, when you're married to people like Roman Polanski, who's clearly, a Luciferian, and I'm going to demonstrate that here in an upcoming slide, some of the fruit in his life. But when you're married, when you choose people like that for a mate, and you have connections with people like the Mansons, and you're making movies called the Eye of the Devil, where you're starring as a witch, and you're having to go through that role playing, and then later in the movie there's going to be a satanic blood sacrifice. You're opening that door and you're inviting the enemy into your house, and you don't know how far it's going to go. And in this situation, it cost her life and the life of her baby. So here's Rosemary's Baby. It was filmed in this building here in the center called the Dakota Building. This is actually where John Lennon lived and where John Lennon was shot and killed. And so, in this movie, where this movie was filmed, there's a lot of occult stuff going on in this building. You hear, Rosemary hears people chanting and doing rituals throughout the building. And so, we've talked about charged writings and charged documents that were inspired from the dark side. We've talked about charged objects, and we've talked about charged art, like Nicholas Roerich's art was charged demonically. And we've talked about charged music. Guys like Jim Morrison, who said that he connected with his spirit guide when he wrote Break On Through to the Other Side, and people like Ozzy Osbourne, who wrote a song to Mr. Crowley. There's all these different charged, things. Well, now I think we're dealing with a charged building. This place is haunted, if you will. When they filmed this movie there and they were portraying Satan, coming in and raping this woman and birthing the Antichrist, that's obviously from the dark side. The idea for that movie, and all of everything moving and pushing this along was spiritual. And so now we're seeing that this building is charged, and unfortunately that same spirit gets a hold of John Lennon later and ends up murdering him, working through a human vessel. But in the movie, on the bottom left you see Rosemary's face when she discovers what's going on. On the bottom right, this is actually from the movie. This is who ended up raping her. This is Satan somehow incarnates into our plane of existence. He rapes Mia Farrow while she's been drugged, and then she ends up giving birth to the Antichrist. And in the top right, this is the Satanic Coven, who tells Rosemary, "Don't worry, it'll be okay." And he has his father's eyes. So it's a pretty crazy film. And if you watch the movie, you'll learn a lot of details about witchcraft, which I felt like the movie was very well portrayed. You think that it's just science fiction or whatever, but it's actually factual. These covens were alive and present in this time. People just didn't know about it. So just to show you the kind of person Roman Polanski was, which I think we've already demonstrated who he was, but later he was charged with 5 offenses against a 13-year-old girl.
And the charges were rape by the use of drugs, perversion, sodomy, and lewd act upon a child under 14, and furnishing a controlled substance to a minor. Now, when he realized that he was going to be prosecuted for this, he ended up fleeing to France in 1978, hours before the sentence was formally conducted. And so he got out of this. And since then, Polanski's lived in France and has avoided visiting countries likely to extradite him to the United States. And this resurfaced again a few years ago where he got arrested and they tried to extradite him, but I think he got out of it. But this woman, this 13-year-old girl, when she grows up, she writes a book over here on the left. Her name is Samantha, and she writes a book, A Life in the Shadow of Roman Polanski. And she describes how at 13 years old, she was invited to Jack Nicholson's condo for a French Vogue photo shoot. And while she was there, she was drugged and then photographed and then raped and sodomized in a hot tub by Roman Polanski. So let's just put that in context. This guy, 10 years previously, had imagined a film called Rosemary's Baby, where a young innocent woman is drugged and raped by Satan in order to produce the Antichrist. And now a decade later, he's going over to his buddy Jack Nicholson's house, and he's drugging a 13-year-old girl and then stripping her down and taking nudie pictures of her, and then raping and sodomizing her, of all things, in a hot tub. I mean, that's as horrific and disgusting as you can think of. And so, these guys are just a bunch of Luciferian Satanists, and there's no telling how far this goes throughout Hollywood, because anybody who's studied Hollywood knows that pedophilia is the predominant thing that takes place in Hollywood. And unfortunately, guys, I hate to do it for some of y'all because you're big Beatles fans, but guess what? They're part of the script too, just like the Rolling Stones. This is a cover of the Sgt. Pepper's album released by the Beatles in the 60s. And on the album, you'll see a picture of Aleister Crowley amongst many others. But Ringo Starr said in a magazine that the people on this cover are people that the Beatles like and admire. Paul McCartney later said that we were going to have photos on the wall of all of our heroes. But John Lennon went on to explain in Playboy magazine that the whole Beatle idea was to do what you want, do what thou willst, as long as it doesn't hurt somebody. And as I'll show you in the next slide, in this group of people right here in the top left is a picture of Aleister Crowley. And so what we find when you study the Beatles is they were highly into the occult. They had gone to a transcendental meditation workshop in India in 1968 and learned how to do all of the astral projections and everything else. And they had admitted that they were under mind-altering drugs when they wrote all their music for the White Album, including the song Helter Skelter, which later triggered Manson to do what he did. And here, in this picture, you can see I blew it up, or it's blown up on the right, the Rolling Stones. They just happened to include the band, the Rolling Stones, on the cover of their album because they're part of this whole little clique, if you will. But basically, these guys were huge Crowley followers. So on this top left image, it shows a picture blown up of Aleister Crowley right there. And, the Beatles admitted that they had Crowley on the cover. And so, when you study the Beatles, these guys were steeped in Eastern mysticism. They actually had their own guru. And if you were to just do a Google search on images and look at the Beatles, 75% of the photos that come up of these guys, you'll see this Hindu guru that they took everywhere with them. Ever since they went to India and they got a guru and they learned all the transcendental meditation and all of the occult stuff, they brought him back with them. And you'll see in almost all of the pictures that he's actually centralized. He's in the middle. It's almost like, you got to understand, a guru is like this spiritual authority. So it's kind of like people who are going to follow around, the Pope or something like that. this guy, this guru, is their spiritual teacher. And so they idolized him, they worshiped him, and they followed everything that he was into. And I think that we've done a good enough job demonstrating what that likely was. Now, in the top right-hand corner is a picture of the Beatles guru, and I find some of the symbolism interesting, right? You see the kind of the yin and the yang symbol because the circle on the left is black and the one on the right is white. But here you see the as above, so below symbolism, right, of Baphomet and Hermes Trismegistus, where you have the downward facing triangle and the upward facing triangle. We understand that what this is now, this is this desire, this henosis of combining man with spirit. And to prove to you that the Beatles truly did have an antichrist spirit, this is when John Lennon got himself into a lot of trouble in the country. During a major interview, he said, "We're more popular than Jesus." He said that in 1966. He went on to say that Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I know I'm right and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me. So, you can clearly see that he had this kind of sarcastic attitude towards Christ and this antichrist spirit. So should it really be shocking that he was involved in all these different things? Here on the bottom left, you can see how the American public responded to that. They wanted to ban the Beatles in the United States. Over here on the right, that symbol where you make the OK symbol with the three fingers up. When you study that is a 666. That's what that symbol means. And these are the first guys to really bring that symbol out in the United States. That symbol was not popular prior to that. Neither were the devil horns that he's doing over here on the side. This isn't, the UT thing going on here. These guys are from England. They could care less about UT. This isn't hook 'em horns. This represents the devil. That's who these guys were serving. And on the top right, you can see a picture of John Lennon and Yoko Ono. That's where they lived, was the Dakota building. And this is where Mark David Chapman ended up shooting John Lennon and killing him. So, it's just a crazy story because we basically have Rosemary's Baby being filmed inside this building. We have John Lennon, who produced all this music that sparked the Helter Skelter Manson movement. And then later we have Mark David Chapman, who is basically a radical fundamental Christian who comes here and ends up killing John Lennon on the steps of the Dakota building. So just a very bizarre story all the way around. One of John Lennon's big hit songs is called Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Aha, imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. This kind of reminds me of Lady Gaga when she said we're birthing a race within a race where there's no prejudice. It's that flowery language, that kind of that feel-good language where you say, yeah, imagine that. Imagine if we were just all a brotherhood of man. But really, when you look at this in context of what we know to be true, that these guys were Aleister Crowley disciples. They were into Thelema. They worshiped Lucifer. They were into Eastern mysticism. It's not a coincidence that they target biblical concepts. They're not saying imagine if there was no Buddha. They're not saying imagine if you couldn't reach enlightenment. They're saying imagine if there's no heaven and there's no hell and no religion. And really, the religion they're pointing out is Christianity. What they're saying in this song is imagine if there's no Christianity. And if we could eliminate Christianity, then you know what? The world would live as one day. Well, guess what? That's exactly what the Bible says is going to happen. As Christianity continues to decline, there's going to come a point where there is going to be a one world system where everybody's going to live as one, only they're all going to be marveling after the beast. So there's a lot of deception in these lyrics and in this charged music. And you know, John Lennon himself said that when you listen to the song Imagine, you can't just listen to it, you need to feel it. What he's saying is you have to let it in, you have to embody it, you know. And he knows that that's one of the ways for it to get into you. So it reminded me of the verse 1 Corinthians 15. If I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. In other words, you know, we have when we have the gospel to respect and love and appreciate, it's because we know that we have a future. That because we are covered by the blood of Jesus and because God has showed us grace and mercy, that one day, even though we are going to die, we're just going to be leaving this world behind and going to a better place where we can be with the Lord. I don't want to imagine that there's no heaven. Um, I want to do the opposite. I want to aspire to go to heaven. And so um, I think that these guys just really missed the boat big time, unfortunately. Moving on, let's just quickly take a look at Led Zeppelin. And you can see on the front of his cover here, Jimmy Page, disciple of Aleister Crowley, 666. He's got a picture of Crowley doing his thing and Jimmy over there on the side. And then down below you see a picture of Jimmy Page holding the steel of revealing and looking in the mirror and seeing his idol Aleister Crowley. And here's his album over here on the left. So, you know, these guys weren't just a little bit followers. They were totally immersed in this thing. Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones were two of the biggest bands that influenced rock and roll within the last 50 years by far. Which brings us to the infamous song Stairway to Heaven. And I hate to do it to y'all because if you're like me, you recognize this song and you know it was an all-time classic. But we're going to break it down real fast and I'm going to show you the reality of it, that you know these occultists, they counterfeit everything. First, they counterfeit everything that God has, and then secondly, they masquerade as an angel of light. But you have to be able to understand that it's the false light. So here is the cover of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. You've got this guy holding this lantern. He almost looks like he's, I don't know, he's kind of got that Grim Reaper look going. But if you blow up the candle, what do you see? You see a six-pointed star with a sunburst effect around it, the rays of illumination, right? And you know, just the average person wouldn't have a clue what that means. But now that you are beginning to understand the power of symbols, remember theurgy, the symbol is a direct link to the archetype. We know that the six-pointed star is referring to this, you know, hexagram, and this burst of light around it is similar to what we see over here to the right on Crowley's head, the burst of light around the all-seeing eye. This is what we're talking about. This little lamp that he has lit up with a six-pointed star with this light around it, it's really referring to the bottom right-hand image, which is the Eye of Horus, or the one who brought about the horizon from the darkness, right? This Horus or Lucifer, the light bringer, that's who Led Zeppelin's working for. And he's trying to shroud it in a very concealed fashion. The other symbolism that you'll notice is that it's blackout. This is nighttime and there's a full moon, and that's what we call the witching hour. That's when the covens come out at midnight and do their curses and their rituals. And then, of course, it says, you know, a stairway to heaven. So which heaven are we talking about here? So let's just examine the song Stairway to Heaven. First of all, it was written by Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and produced in 1971. And it turns out that it was placed at number 31 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. That's pretty darn good to be the number 31 song basically in recorded human history. And so the song goes like this. There's a lady who's sure all that glitters is gold, and she's buying a stairway to heaven. When she gets there, she knows, if the stores are all closed, with a word she can get what she came for. Oh, oh, and she's buying a stairway to heaven. There's a sign on the wall, but she wants to be sure, 'cause you know sometimes words have two meanings. You got to remember, these guys are heavy into the occult, and the word occult means to be hidden but in plain sight. So in a tree by the brook, there's a songbird who sings. Sometimes all our thoughts are misgiven. Oh, it makes me wonder, oh, it makes me wonder. There's a feeling I get when I look to the west, and my spirit is crying for leaving. In my thoughts I've seen rings of smoke through the trees, and the voices of those who stand looking. Oh, it makes me wonder, oh, it really makes me wonder. And it's whispered that soon, if we all call the tune, then the piper will lead us to reason. He's obviously talking about the piper over here on the right. We know that Jimmy Page was so into Aleister Crowley that he actually purchased his old house in Loch Ness Monster, and he was obsessed with Crowleyism. And we know Crowley actually wrote hymns to the god Pan, the Pied Piper Pan. So here he's saying that, and it's whispered that we can all call the tune. You know, the piper plays a tune that mesmerizes you and leads you down the wrong path. And then a new day will dawn for those who stand long, and the forest will echo with laughter. When the day dawns, that's when Osiris births Horus, and Horus is the one who comes over the horizon and brings the dawn of the day. That's where we get the word horizon from. And then the forest will echo with laughter. Usually the piper leads the people and the children. He mesmerizes them out of the village and into the woods, into the forests. If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now. It's just a spring clean for the May Queen. The May Queen is, Aleister Crowley wrote a long poem titled The May Queen. It's an interesting poem. I didn't include it for time's sake, but we can know for certain that this is in reference to Crowley's poem, The May Queen. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. And it makes me wonder, your head is humming, and it won't go, in case you don't know, the piper's calling you to join him. So he's saying, yeah, there's two roads, all right. You can take the right-hand path, or you can take the left-hand path, but the piper's calling all of us to take the left-hand path. And there's still time for that. Dear lady, can you hear the wind blow, and did you know that your stairway lies on the whispering wind? And as we wind on down the road, our shadows taller than our soul, there walks a lady we all know who shines white light and wants to show how everything still turns to gold. And if you listen very hard, the tune will come to you at last when all are one and one is all. So now he's talking about this stairway the stairway that leads to heaven. This stairway is a doorway. This song is about opening up your mind, going into Crowleyism and opening up the eye of Horus, which is the pineal gland. We'll learn that later. And that when you open up the pineal gland, you open up a doorway or a stairway between us and the spirit realm, where then you can move on into that realm where the lady shines the white light and everything looks like gold. It's that counterfeit light we've been talking about. And then at last, if you listen very hard, the tune will come that all are one and one is all. So, you know, at first glance, it doesn't seem very misleading, but I assure you it is. You've got Pan the Piper over here on the right. That's where Peter Pan comes from. That's also where the Disney version of the Pied Piper comes from. Here on the bottom right, I've included an image of the Pied Piper. He's the guy who kind of looks like Peter Pan, who plays his flute and lures the kids out of town. So it's interesting, the alleged message which occurs during the middle section of the song in the lyrics, if there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now, when played backwards, was purported to contain the satanic references, here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He'll give you 666. There was a little tool shed where he made us suffer, sad Satan. And so most people are going to kind of go, oh boy, here we go. Now we're talking about listening to music backwards. But keep it all in context and listen to the full body of information, because Crowley had something to say about that in his teachings.
The first thing I'll say is if you are going to listen to music backwards, then I'm making it clear to you right now that you need to pray over it. You need to be covered by the blood of Jesus Christ, because it is extremely freaky to listen to things backwards. For example, there are songs that you can listen to by the Beatles, where John Lennon sings a song and Yoko Ono's in it, and when you play it backwards, you can actually hear some kind of beast having sex with her, and she's grunting, and you can hear this animal over the top of her, and at the end of the song you hear a whisper, and it's Yoko Ono's voice saying, "I shot John Lennon." And it's a freaky thing to do, to listen to music backwards like that. Well, it turns out that it's based on a real principle that Aleister Crowley himself taught in his book, Magic and Theory and Practice, and it's called the Occult Law of Reversal, which is a major law of Satanism. The law teaches to do everything backwards. In many satanic churches, they will recite the Lord's Prayer backwards, and instead of starting with Amen, they say the word Nema, and then they recite the whole prayer backwards. This came from Aleister Crowley's book. Train himself to think backwards by external means, as set forth here following. Let him learn to write backwards, let him learn to walk backwards, let him learn to listen to phonograph records reversed, let him practice speaking backwards, and let him learn to read backwards. And this came from his book. So this is not a made-up concept. This comes from the master occultist himself, and this is clearly a form of divination that we're warned against in the Bible. But, if you look at some of the examples of this, for example, they have the Black Mass, which is the entire Roman Catholic liturgy, which is performed backwards. Everything is read backwards. The cross and the Black Mass is hung upside down, and they say the Our Father backwards. Other examples are the person of the Antichrist, who's the direct opposite of Jesus Christ. We're talking about the law of reversal here. Heaven is the reversal of hell, right? Heaven's up, hell is down. God is light while Satan is dark. Jesus will send the sheep on his right hand and the goats to his left, the opposite. So make no mistake, this law of reversal does exist, and it has a lot to do with the whole as above, so below. That's a reversal too. When you see Baphomet pointing up at the white moon, he's pointing down at the black moon, the law of reversal. When you study Freemasonry, you always see the checkered floors in all of their pictures, because you have the white and black checkers, which represent dualism and the law of reversal. So this is a very powerful law, and Aleister Crowley did teach to listen to phonographs backwards. If the music was inspired demonically and charged, then what Crowley taught was, one of the ways that you could always pick up on a demonically charged music is if you listen to it backwards. There'll be hidden messages in it. So I just proved to you that the Stairway to Heaven was a demonically charged song written basically for the purposes of Crowley and the God Pan and the May Queen. So is it shocking to think that there's a portion of it that could have a hidden message when listened to backwards? I don't think that it is. And it reminds me of the verse in Isaiah 5, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." So what Isaiah is saying here is that there is a law of reversal. There's going to be a group of people out there that are going to turn everything upside down.
Okay, guys, I think that's enough for now. That's 2 hours. I was going to try and include Ron L. Hubbard with Scientology, but he's going to have to wait till the next one. I was also going to try and include George Van Tassel, who was part of the UFO movement. Keep all this in context with ufology, because that's where we're going next. I just want to review that, Aleister Crowley basically birthed this New Age movement through the Book of the Law. And you've got guys like Jack Parsons, who's a nuclear physicist who started Jet Propulsion's laboratory and became one of the fathers of NASA, who's doing rituals. He hooked up with Ron L. Hubbard and Marjorie Cameron, the father of Scientology, and this famous artist and movie actress, to try and create the Babylon working ritual to incarnate the spirit of Babylon that would birth the Antichrist, where they shattered the boundaries of space and time. Meanwhile, you've got guys like Kenneth Grant, who are producing movies about minotaurs and demigods when he's younger, and then joins the Church of Thelema and starts making movies like Lucifer, Rising, and Invocation of My Demon Brother, and is using people to produce his movies and the music that are famous rock and roll stars like Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones. And also he hires Bobby Beausoleil to star as Lucifer, who is also in the Manson family. And then the Manson family go on and end up murdering Roman Polanski's wife, Sharon Tate, and her 8.5-month pregnant baby as a satanic ritual, which was based on Roman Polanski's film Rosemary Baby that was produced a year prior about, the sacrifice of this child to Satan to become the Antichrist. And then lastly, it connects us to the Beatles, who were steeped in the occult, huge Crowley followers, to the point where they put him on some of the covers of their albums and wrote several songs that were inspired by the dark side, including Helter Skelter, which triggered Manson's debauchery. So, as I've said before, there's a super sophisticated spirit that's moving through all of these people. And this really just scratches the surface of music. I mean, the Beatles, this is the 50s. This is really the birth of rock and roll. And then that leads a segue into the 60s, where we really see the hippie movement, the free love movement, and we see the sex, drugs, and rock and roll movement with bands like Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and other groups like Jim Morrison and the Doors, who, when you spend time studying them, you'll find out that they were Crowley followers as well. And so what you realize is the entire music industry that we know today was birthed from this channeled document called the Book of the Law. And that's how powerful it is. And when Crowley said that it was prophetic and it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy over the next 100 years, he wasn't lying. It's exactly what took place. For now, we're going to move on to some other areas that are going to start really focusing on the UFO movement, because that's ultimately what the presentation is about, is the last days and how all of this is going to manifest in the future. I've already given you multiple examples. For example, Kenneth Grant's album shows a picture of the Sphinx with a pyramid over it with a UFO flying over it. That's not a coincidence. I've shown you things like Jack Parsons, when he did the Babylon working ritual and then his wife saw a UFO the next day, he said that was the spirit, that was the physical materialization of the spirit of Babylon. Later, Marjorie Cameron, when she tried to do a blood ritual and she cut herself, she cut her arms to bleed out in order to connect with the spirit beings and to try to hook up with Jack Parsons' spirit. She saw a UFO over Washington, D.C., and she took that as a confirmation that was spirits, that was Jack Parsons' spirit communicating with her. We've already talked about things like the Cult of Lamb by Kenneth Grant, who said that that lamb, when you do the egg of the spirit, that you enter into the head of lamb and you use his head as an astral space capsule that you can travel through the spirit realm and see other worlds and other extraterrestrial beings. And he went on to say that Lamb, the gray alien, was an archetype of the occupants within the UFOs. So it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And unfortunately, the rabbit trail is about to go a lot deeper, because here soon we're going to delve into UFO abduction phenomenon and some of the UFO religions, etc. And on that note, I think we're done. We'll see you on the next round.